is how to spell my name correctly!
She was just 8 years old, standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin, holding up her boarding pass while every passenger watched in complete silence. The flight attendant's face had turned crimson red as this little girl calmly spelled out her own name, letter by letter, then looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Now spell hypocrite." The entire cabin erupted. But let me tell you exactly how we got here, because what happened on Flight 1847 would change everything. It was a Thursday morning at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, and Gate C-24 was buzzing with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch Flight 1847 to Washington, D.C. But in the middle of all that chaos stood a little girl who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Sharon Collins was 8 years old, and today was the biggest day of her life. She stood barely 4 feet tall, wearing a navy blue cardigan that her grandmother had ironed twice that morning, a pressed khaki skirt that came down to her knees, and oversized glasses that kept slipping down her nose no matter how many times she pushed them back up. Her natural hair was styled in 2 neat puffs, each one tied with burgundy ribbons that matched the achievement stickers covering her small purple suitcase. Those stickers told a story: perfect attendance, honor roll, reading champion, math Olympiad, science fair winner. This wasn't just any 8-year-old. Sharon was traveling alone for the first time in her life, and she was terrified. But she had a reason to be brave. She was heading to the National Young Scholars Competition in Washington, D.C., and she wasn't just any participant. Sharon Collins was the youngest qualifier in the competition's entire history. At 8 years old, she read at a college level. She could solve equations that stumped high schoolers. She could discuss literature with adults twice, 3 times her age. But here's what made Sharon's story even more remarkable. She had done all of this while carrying a grief that no child should ever have to bear. 3 years ago, when Sharon was just 5, her parents were killed in a car accident. One moment she had a mother who sang to her every night and a father who called her his little genius, and the next moment she had nothing but memories and a grandmother who promised to love her enough for 3 people. Lucille Collins had raised Sharon from that day forward, and she had poured everything she had into this child. Every sacrifice, every extra shift at the hospital where she worked as a janitor, every prayer she whispered in the dark when the bills piled up, it was all for Sharon. Lucille Collins was a woman of faith and dignity. At 67 years old, her hair had turned completely silver, but her spirit was still strong. She was a church-going woman who believed in doing right by people, in working hard, and in trusting God with the rest. For 6 months, she had saved every extra dollar she could find to help pay for this trip. The competition sponsors had provided the flight ticket, but there were other expenses: a new outfit for Sharon, spending money, emergency funds just in case. Lucille had worked double shifts, skipped meals, and pushed through exhaustion because her grandbaby was going to have everything she needed to succeed. That morning, Lucille had worn her Sunday best to the airport. A lavender dress she'd owned for 15 years, pressed and perfect, with matching shoes she only wore for church and special occasions. She walked Sharon all the way to the security checkpoint, holding her hands so tight that Sharon had to remind her it was okay to let go. At the security line, Lucille knelt down in front of Sharon, her knees creaking with arthritis, and carefully pinned the unaccompanied minor badge to her granddaughter's cardigan. Her hands were shaking, not from age but from the weight of this moment. She was sending her baby into the world alone. "You remember everything I told you?" Lucille whispered, her eyes already glistening with tears she was trying hard not to shed. Sharon nodded, pushing her glasses up. "Yes, ma'am. Stay with the flight attendants. Don't talk to strangers. Call you as soon as I land." "And what else, baby?" Sharon's voice got quieter. "Hold my head high. I belong anywhere I go. I'm smart, I'm loved, and I'm enough." Lucille pulled her into a hug so tight that Sharon could barely breathe, and she whispered prayers over her granddaughter's head, prayers for protection, for confidence, for the right people to watch over her baby when she couldn't be there herself. When they finally pulled apart, both of them had tears streaming down their faces. "You go show them what Lucille Collins's grandbaby can do," Lucille said, wiping Sharon's cheeks with her thumb. "Your mama and daddy are watching from heaven, and they are so proud of you." Sharon walked through security alone, turning back 3 times to wave at her grandmother, who stood there until Sharon disappeared completely from view. And then Lucille Collins sat down in the nearest chair and cried like her heart was breaking, because letting go is the hardest thing love ever asks us to do. On the other side of security, Sharon rolled her purple suitcase through the terminal, following the signs to gate C-24. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had flown before, but always with her grandmother, always with someone holding her hand. Now she was alone, and the airport felt massive and overwhelming. She kept her head down, counting the floor tiles as she walked, a habit she'd developed to calm her anxiety. When she finally reached gate C-24, she saw that boarding had already begun. The gate agent, a tired-looking woman with red hair, glanced at Sharon's ticket and directed her to the priority boarding line. Sharon didn't understand why until she looked down at her ticket and saw the words, First Class, Seat 2A. The competition sponsors had given her a first-class ticket. She'd never sat in first class before. She wasn't even sure what first class meant, except that it was at the front of the plane. Sharon wheeled her suitcase down the jetway, her hands gripping the handle so tight her knuckles turned pale. When she stepped onto the plane, the first thing she noticed was how different everything looked. The seats were huge, covered in leather. There was more space, more light. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, greeting passengers with a bright smile. This was Beverly Hutchins, and she'd been a flight attendant for 15 years. She was in her mid-40s, with a blonde bob cut so precisely it looked like she measured it with a ruler every morning. She had the kind of smile that looked painted on, tight and controlled, the smile of someone who'd perfected customer service but forgot genuine warmth somewhere along the way. She wore her uniform like armor, every crease sharp, every button polished. Sharon approached her, holding out her boarding pass with both hands, the way her grandmother had taught her to hand things to adults, politely and respectfully. "Hello, ma'am," Sharon said quietly. "I'm in seat 2A. Beverly took the boarding pass and her smile flickered for just a second. She looked at the ticket, then at Sharon, then back at the ticket again. Her eyes traveled from Sharon's face down to her purple suitcase with all its stickers, then back up again. Something shifted in her expression, something subtle that Sharon couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. "Is this really your seat, sweetie?" Beverly asked, her voice dripping with a sweetness that somehow didn't feel sweet at all. Sharon nodded. "Yes, ma'am. The competition gave it to me." "Competition?" Beverly glanced at the ticket again, as if looking for proof that this 8-year-old black girl in her oversized glasses actually belonged in first class. "The National Young Scholars Competition, ma'am. In Washington, D.C. Beverly's smile got tighter. "Well, isn't that something?" She held onto the boarding pass a moment longer than necessary before handing it back. "Go ahead and take your seat then, sweetie. Seat 2A on the right." Sharon walked past her, rolling her suitcase down the aisle. She could feel Beverly's eyes on her back, could feel the weight of that look even though she didn't fully understand what it meant yet. She found her seat and struggled to lift her suitcase into the overhead bin. She was too short and the bin was too high, and her arms were shaking from nervousness and effort. A man's voice came from behind her. "Need some help there?" Sharon turned to see a man in an expensive-looking suit standing in the aisle. He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, the kind of man who looked like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. This was Preston Whitmore IV, a tech investor worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He had the air of someone important, someone used to being listened to. "Yes, sir, please," Sharon said quietly. Preston lifted her suitcase into the overhead bin like it weighed nothing. "There you go. First time flying alone?" Sharon nodded, sliding into her seat by the window. "You'll do fine," Preston said, taking his seat across the aisle in 2C. He opened his Wall Street Journal and seemed to forget about Sharon entirely, which was fine with her. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to get to Washington, D.C. without messing anything up. But as other passengers boarded and found their seats, Sharon noticed something. Beverly kept walking past her seat, kept glancing over at her, kept asking if she needed anything in a voice that sounded helpful but felt like something else entirely. Each time Beverly said her name, it came out wrong. "Sharon, would you like some water?" "Sharon, let me know if you need anything." Sharon's name wasn't complicated. It was 5 letters. Sharon. Like the word sharing but with an "on" at the end. She'd been correcting people her whole life, gently, politely, the way her grandmother taught her. But something about the way Beverly said it felt deliberate, like she wasn't even trying to get it right. Preston Whitmore glanced up from his newspaper, watching this interaction. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed Beverly as she walked away, and something in his expression suggested he'd seen exactly what Sharon had felt. The plane was filling up now. Passengers settled into their seats, stowing luggage, adjusting air vents, buckling seat belts. Sharon pulled out a small leather journal from her backpack, a gift from her grandmother. On the first page in Lucille's careful handwriting it said, "For my Sharon, write your story. Make it a good one." Sharon opened to a blank page and began to write about how she was feeling. Scared, excited, missing her grandmother already, wishing her parents could see her now. She wrote about the competition, about hoping she wouldn't freeze up during the spelling rounds, about wanting to make everyone proud. She had no idea that in less than an hour, this flight would become a story she'd tell for the rest of her life. She had no idea that the woman who couldn't seem to pronounce her name correctly was about to push her too far. And she had no idea that sometimes, the smallest voices carry the most power when they finally decide to speak up. But before we get to what happened next, I need you to do something. If this story is hitting you the way I think it is, if you want to see how little Sharon Collins stood up for herself in a way that left an entire cabin speechless, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next proves that dignity doesn't have an age limit, and sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the smallest teachers. Now, let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where someone deliberately mispronounced your name or dismissed you because of how you looked? How did it make you feel, and what did you do about it? Drop your answer in the comments, because your stories matter just as much as Sharon's. The plane was about to take off, and none of these passengers knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. The cabin doors closed with that heavy thunk that signals there's no turning back now, and the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom welcoming everyone aboard Flight 1847 to Washington, D.C. Sharon sat in her window seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, trying to remember everything her grandmother had told her about being brave. But bravery gets a whole lot harder when someone keeps chipping away at your dignity piece by piece. Beverly Hutchins was making her way through the first-class cabin now, checking seat belts and overhead bins, doing that final sweep flight attendants do before takeoff. When she got to Sharon's row, she stopped and pulled out her passenger manifest, the little printed sheet that had everyone's names and seat assignments. "Okay, let me just confirm," Beverly said, running her perfectly manicured finger down the list. "You're in 2A, so you must be Sharon." "Sharon?" She said it like it was a question, like the name itself was some kind of puzzle she needed help solving. Sharon looked up at her, pushing her glasses up her nose. "It's just Sharon, ma'am?" Like the word, sharing, but with Sharon at the end. Beverly tilted her head, that tight smile still plastered on her face. "Sharon? Sharon? This is so unusual. I've never heard it pronounced that way before. Now let's be very clear about something here. Sharon is not an unusual name. It's been around for decades. It's 5 letters, 2 syllables, straightforward as they come. Beverly Hutchins had been a flight attendant for 15 years. She'd served thousands of passengers, encountered names from every corner of the globe, names with silent letters and unexpected pronunciations, names from languages she'd never studied. But somehow Sharon was giving her trouble. Sharon felt her stomach tighten. "It's just Sharon, ma'am?" "Sharon." "Well, all right then, Sharon," Beverly said, saying it wrong again even after Sharon had just corrected her. She moved on to the next row, leaving Sharon sitting there feeling small and confused. At the front of the cabin, near the galley, another flight attendant had been watching this entire exchange. His name was Dylan Park, and he was young, maybe 24, 25 at most. This was his first year working for the airline, and he still had that eager energy of someone who actually cared about doing the job right. He was Asian American, with kind eyes and an easy smile that made passengers feel comfortable. But right now he wasn't smiling. He was frowning, his brow furrowed as he watched Beverly walk away from Sharon's seat. Dylan had worked enough flights with Beverly to recognize what was happening. He'd seen her do this before, this thing where she'd be perfectly lovely to some passengers and subtly dismissive to others. He'd never said anything about it because he was on probation, still in his first year, still trying to prove himself. But watching her do it to an 8-year-old child made his stomach turn. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and that's when Beverly's voice came over the PA system, bright and cheerful. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant Beverly speaking. Before we take off, I need to do a quick safety check. Sharon Collins in seat 2A, please make sure your seatbelt is fastened." Sharon's face burned. Every passenger in first class turned to look at her. She was already buckled in, had been since the moment she sat down, but now everyone was staring. And her name, her simple, beautiful name that her mother had chosen because it meant a plain, or a flat area, a place of peace, was being butchered over the loudspeaker for everyone to hear. "It's Sharon," she said quietly, but Beverly was already back in the galley, chatting with another flight attendant. 2 minutes later, Beverly's voice came over the PA again. "Sharon Collins, please ensure your tray table is in the upright position." Sharon's tray table was already up. It had never been down. But she checked it anyway, her hands trembling slightly as other passengers continued to glance in her direction. Across the aisle, Preston Whitmore lowered his Wall Street Journal. He'd been trying to focus on an article about tech startups, but he couldn't concentrate anymore. He was watching this little girl in her navy cardigan and oversized glasses, watching the way her shoulders hunched a little more each time that flight attendant said her name wrong. Preston had spent his entire career reading people, understanding power dynamics, recognizing when someone was being deliberately undermined. And this, what he was witnessing right now, was deliberate. Sharon tried one more time. When Beverly walked past her seat again, Sharon spoke up, her voice polite but firm. "Excuse me, ma'am. My name is Sharon. Just Sharon. You're saying it wrong." Beverly stopped, turned, and gave Sharon that patronizing smile adults give children when they think the child is being difficult. "Sweetheart, I'm doing my best. It's just such an unusual pronunciation." "But it's not unusual," Sharon said, her voice getting smaller despite her best efforts. "It's a common name." Beverly sighed like Sharon was exhausting her. "Well, honey, maybe your parents should have given you an easier name if they didn't want people to struggle with it." The words hung in the air like poison. Sharon's face, which had been flushed with embarrassment, went completely pale. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "My parents passed away." The cabin got very quiet. A few passengers who'd been scrolling on their phones before the airplane mode announcement looked up. Dylan Park, who was checking overhead bins 2 rows back, froze completely. Even Preston Whitmore's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened around it. Beverly Hutchins had just been told that this 8-year-old child's parents were dead, and here's what she did next. Absolutely nothing. No apology. No acknowledgement. No moment of human decency. Instead, she just pivoted, her smile never wavering, and said, "Well, your grandmother then. Where is she from anyway?" Sharon blinked, confused by the question. "Ma'am? Your grandmother. Where is she from? Originally?" Sharon's confusion deepened. "Cincinnati, Ohio. Same as me." Beverly's smile got even tighter, like that answer wasn't the one she was fishing for. "I see. Well, make sure you stay seated during takeoff, Sharon." And this one single time she said the name correctly, but it sounded like it physically pained her to do it. She walked away, leaving Sharon sitting there trying to process what had just happened. This little girl had just lost both her parents in a car accident 3 years ago, was traveling alone for the first time in her life, was anxious and scared and trying so hard to be brave, and this adult woman had thrown her grief back in her face without even a hint of compassion. Dylan Park couldn't take it anymore. While Beverly was busy in the galley, he grabbed a small package of cookies from the snack cart and brought them to Sharon's seat. He knelt down in the aisle so he was at her eye level and handed them to her. "Here," he said softly. "These are the good ones. We usually save them for later in the flight, but I think you should have them now." Sharon took the cookies, her eyes still shiny with unshed tears. "Thank you." Dylan glanced back toward the galley to make sure Beverly wasn't watching. "I'm sorry about that," he whispered. "Your name is beautiful and she's saying it wrong on purpose. I just wanted you to know that I noticed and it's not okay." It was such a small act of kindness, but to Sharon in that moment, it meant everything. It meant she wasn't imagining things. It meant someone saw what was happening and cared. She nodded at Dylan, not trusting herself to speak without crying. Dylan stood up and went back to his duties, but something had shifted in the cabin. Other passengers were paying attention now. This wasn't just background noise anymore. This was something people were actively witnessing. Behind Sharon, in seats 3A and 3B, sat an elderly couple. Robert and Patricia Dalton had been married for 43 years and had flown more times than they could count. Robert was 71, a retired lawyer with thick white hair and the kind of presence that suggested he'd spent his life in courtrooms. Patricia was 68, a former school teacher with sharp eyes that missed nothing. They'd been listening to everything, and neither of them had said a word. Their silence felt heavy, and Sharon could feel it behind her, though she didn't know yet whether they disapproved of her or of Beverly. Across the aisle from Sharon, in seat 2D, sat a woman Sharon hadn't really noticed before. Her name was Vanessa Chin, and she was 34 years old, a documentary filmmaker who'd spent the last 5 years making films about everyday moments of injustice, the kind of moments that most people witnessed but chose to ignore. She had her phone positioned carefully on her tray table, the camera facing toward Sharon's row, and she was recording everything. Not obviously, not intrusively, but deliberately. Because Vanessa knew that sometimes the only way to make people believe something happened was to show them the proof. The plane was picking up speed now, racing down the runway, and Sharon felt that familiar pressure as the nose lifted and the ground fell away. She loved flying, usually loved that moment when everything on Earth got small and you realized how big the world really was. But today she just felt alone. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her leather journal, the one her grandmother had given her that morning. The one with Lucille's handwriting on the first page. For my Sharon, write your story. Make it a good one. Sharon opened to a blank page and began to write, her handwriting small and careful. She wrote about missing her parents, about how her mother used to braid her hair every morning and her father used to quiz her on spelling words at breakfast. She wrote about her grandmother, about how hard Lucille worked to give her opportunities, about how she couldn't let her down. She wrote about the competition, about how terrified she was that she'd get there and freeze up, that she'd forget everything she'd studied, that she wouldn't belong with all those other kids who probably had 2 parents and stable homes and hadn't spent the last 3 years learning how to grieve while still doing their homework. And then she wrote something that would break your heart. I need to prove I belong here. I need to show them that kids like me deserve to be in first class too. She was so focused on her writing that she didn't notice Beverly approaching until the woman's hand shot out and snatched the journal right out of her grip. No loose items during taxi, Beverly said sharply. Sharon looked up, startled. But ma'am, the seatbelt sign isn't on yet. We're already in the air. Beverly's eyes narrowed. Don't talk back to me, young lady. I know the rules. I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. I wasn't talking back, Sharon said, her voice shaking now. I was just saying. You were just saying nothing, Beverly interrupted. This needs to be stowed. She held up the journal like it was evidence of Sharon's wrongdoing. Sharon reached for it. Can I please just? No. Beverly walked to the overhead bin directly above Sharon's seat, opened it and tossed the journal inside. Not placed it carefully. Tossed it. Sharon heard it land with a thud against her suitcase. The entire first-class cabin was watching now. Vanessa Chen adjusted her phone slightly, making sure she captured the overhead bin, Beverly's face, Sharon's expression. Preston Whitmore had completely abandoned his newspaper. Dylan Park stood frozen in the galley, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle working. And behind Sharon, Patricia Dalton leaned forward slightly and whispered to her husband, Robert, this is wrong. Robert Dalton nodded slowly. He'd seen a lot in his 71 years. He'd been a civil rights lawyer in the 1960s, had fought actual battles for justice in courtrooms across the South. He'd thought those days were behind him, thought the world had changed enough that he could retire in peace. But watching this flight attendant systematically demean an 8-year-old black child, he felt something old and familiar rising in his chest. Anger. The righteous kind. Beverly walked back to the galley, satisfied that she'd put Sharon in her place. But she'd made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that everyone in that cabin either agreed with her or didn't care enough to get involved. She'd assumed wrong. Sharon sat in her seat, staring at the closed overhead bin, fighting back tears. She wanted her journal. She wanted her grandmother. She wanted to be anywhere but here. But most of all, she wanted to understand why this woman hated her so much when they'd never even met before today. The plane climbed higher into the sky, and the tension in first class climbed right along with it. Because here's the thing about injustice, it builds. It accumulates. It stacks up moment by moment until something has to give. And everyone in that cabin could feel it building, could sense that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Beverly Hutchins thought she was in control. She thought she'd successfully put this child in her place, reminded her that just because she had a first-class ticket didn't mean she belonged there. But what Beverly didn't know was that Sharon Collins wasn't just any 8-year-old. She was a child who'd survived the unthinkable, who'd rebuilt herself from grief, who'd worked harder than most adults just to feel worthy of taking up space in the world. And she was about to reach her limit. But before we get to that moment, before I show you what happened when Sharon finally stood up for herself, I need you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Because what's about to happen next is going to restore your faith in the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how small you are or how big the person opposing you seems to be. Subscribe right now because this story is just getting started. Now let me ask you something, and I really want to know your answer. When you've witnessed someone being treated unfairly, whether it's a child, a coworker, a stranger in public, did you speak up or did you stay silent? And if you stayed silent, what stopped you? Tell me in the comments, because understanding why good people stay quiet is just as important as celebrating when they finally speak up. The flight attendant call button above seat 3B suddenly lit up. Patricia Dalton had pressed it. And when Beverly Hutchins saw who was calling her, she had no idea that everything was about to change. Patricia Dalton's call button was still lit up, glowing like a tiny beacon of reckoning above seat 3B. Beverly Hutchins saw it and sighed, the kind of sigh that said she was already annoyed before she even knew what the request would be. She smoothed down her uniform, fixed her smile back into place and walked down the aisle. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" Beverly asked, her voice dripping with professional sweetness. Patricia looked up at her with eyes that had seen everything and tolerated nonsense from no one. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that the child in front of us has been nothing but polite this entire flight." Beverly's smile flickered. "I'm sorry?" "The little girl, Sharon. She's been respectful and well-mannered, and I think she deserves to be treated with the same courtesy you're showing the rest of us." The air in the cabin shifted. Other passengers were openly listening now, not even pretending to be occupied with their phones or magazines. Beverly's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I assure you, ma'am, I treat all passengers with equal respect," Beverly said, her voice tight. Robert Dalton leaned forward from his seat, his white hair catching the overhead light. His voice was measured but firm, the voice of a man who'd spent decades in courtrooms demanding justice. "I've been flying for 40 years, young lady. 40 years. And what I've witnessed on this flight is disgraceful." Beverly's smile vanished completely now. Her face went from flushed to pale. "Sir, I don't know what you think you've witnessed, but—" "We all know exactly what we've witnessed," Patricia cut in. "And it stops now." Before Beverly could respond, Dylan Park's voice came over the PA system. He'd been standing in the galley watching everything unfold, and he'd made a decision. His job might be on the line, but his conscience couldn't take it anymore. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Flight Attendant Dylan Park speaking. I just wanted to take a moment to recognize some notable passengers we have on board today." His voice was nervous but determined. "We have several distinguished travelers with us, but I'd particularly like to acknowledge a very special young lady in seat 2A. Sharon's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide behind her oversized glasses. Dylan continued, reading from the notes he'd seen on the passenger manifest. "Sharon Collins is traveling to Washington, D.C. to compete in the National Young Scholars Competition. She's the youngest qualifier in the competition's history, and we're honored to have her on board. We wish you the very best, Sharon." The cabin erupted in polite applause. Sharon's face turned bright red, not from embarrassment this time but from surprise. A few passengers called out congratulations. One man in the back of first class actually stood up slightly to see who this remarkable child was. And then Preston Whitmore's voice cut through the applause, sharp with interest. "Wait, did you say the National Young Scholars Competition?" Dylan nodded from the galley. "Yes, sir." Preston turned in his seat to look directly at Sharon. "I sponsor that competition. Have for the last 8 years. Which category are you competing in?" Sharon's voice was barely above a whisper, shy and uncertain. "Spelling and linguistics, sir." Preston's eyebrows shot up. "Spelling and linguistics? At 8 years old?" "Yes, sir. That's the most competitive category. The championship level. How did you—" And that's when Beverly's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. She was still standing in the aisle near the Dalton seats, and she let out a scoff, audible and deliberate. "Spelling? And she's named Sharon? That's rich." The cabin went from warm and congratulatory to ice-cold in half a second. Preston Whitmore slowly turned his head to look at Beverly, his expression transforming from curiosity to something much harder. But he didn't address her yet. He turned back to Sharon, his voice deliberately gentle now. "Sharon, what level are you competing at exactly?" Sharon swallowed hard. "Championship level, sir. Ages 8 to 12. "And how many kids qualify at championship level in your category?" 32, sir. "From the entire country?" Preston nodded slowly, processing this. 32 children from millions. That's exceptional. Beverly, who'd been edging back toward the galley, muttered just loud enough for people to hear, "Must be a diversity thing." The cabin didn't just go quiet. It went silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone simultaneously realizes they're witnessing something that crosses a line. The kind of silence that precedes explosions. Preston Whitmore IV was a man who'd built a tech empire worth billions. He'd negotiated with world leaders, fired executives, demolished competitors in boardrooms across the globe. He was not a man who raised his voice often because he'd learned long ago that the most devastating words are delivered coldly and precisely. And when he spoke now, his voice could have frozen water. "Excuse me?" Beverly's face went from defiant to panicked in the space of a heartbeat. She realized, too late, that she'd just insulted a child in front of a man who sponsored the very competition that child was traveling to. She tried to backtrack, stammering. "I just mean, special programs, outreach initiatives, they're wonderful, of course very important for—" "Stop talking," Preston said, his voice quiet but absolute. Just stop. Beverly's mouth snapped shut. And then Sharon Collins did something that nobody expected. This 8-year-old child who'd been quiet and polite and accommodating for the entire flight, who'd absorbed every insult and microaggression with nothing but gentle corrections, finally reached her limit. Her voice started shaking, but it was clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. My name is spelled Shron. 5 letters. Would you like me to spell it again? Beverly turned to look at her, startled. I know how to spell, thank you very much. Sharon pushed her glasses up her nose, and when she spoke again, there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there before. Then why have you been saying it wrong for 20 minutes? The question hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what it was. Because everyone in that cabin knew the answer. Beverly hadn't been struggling with Sharon's name. She'd been weaponizing it. Vanessa Chin, the documentary filmmaker in Seat 2D, adjusted her phone slightly, making sure she captured every second of this moment. Her heart was pounding. This was it. This was the moment when the underestimated stopped accepting their treatment and started demanding better. Patricia Dalton spoke up again, her voice ringing with authority. The child has been nothing but polite. She's corrected you gently, she said please and thank you, she's followed every instruction. And you've treated her with nothing but contempt. Robert Dalton added, his lawyer's voice carrying the weight of decades fighting injustice. I've been flying for 40 years. I've seen flight attendants deal with drunk passengers, belligerent passengers, passengers who actually deserve to be put in their place. This child has done nothing wrong. Nothing. And what you've done to her is disgraceful. Beverly looked around the cabin wildly, searching for support, for someone to back her up, for anyone to agree that she was just doing her job. But every face she saw was either angry, disappointed, or deliberately looking away. She was alone and she knew it. I don't need passengers telling me how to do my job, she said, her voice rising defensively. I've been doing this for 15 years. 15 years. Dylan Park stepped out of the galley. His hands were shaking, but he spoke anyway. Beverly, maybe we should just. Beverly whirled on him, and the mask of professionalism finally cracked completely. You're on probation, Dylan. You stay out of this. One more word from you and I'll make sure you don't make it past your first year. Dylan's face went pale, but he didn't move. He stood his ground even though it might cost him his job. Because some things are more important than job security. Preston Whitmore stood up. At 6 feet tall, in his expensive suit, with the bearing of a man who commanded respect in every room he entered, he was an imposing presence. He looked at Beverly with the kind of expression that had made Fortune 500 CEOs reconsider their entire business strategies. Let me make something very clear, Preston said, his voice carrying to every corner of first class. Sharon Collins is not in that competition because of diversity initiatives or special programs. She's there because she outperformed thousands of other children in standardized testing. She qualified on merit. Pure, undeniable merit. He gestured toward Sharon, who was sitting very still, her hands gripping the armrests. This child reads at a college level. At 8 years old. She can spell words that most adults couldn't even define. She's competing against children up to 12 years old, and she's expected to place in the top 10 based on her preliminary scores. Beverly opened her mouth, but Preston held up a hand. I'm not finished. I personally review the files of every scholarship recipient in that competition. I've read Sharon's file. I know that she's being raised by her grandmother, a hospital janitor who works double shifts. I know that her parents died 3 years ago. I know that she still qualified for this competition while dealing with grief that would break most adults. His voice got quieter, which somehow made it more powerful. And you've spent this entire flight trying to make her feel like she doesn't belong here. A child. An 8-year-old child who's already overcome more than you can imagine. Tears were streaming down Sharon's face now, but she wasn't making a sound. She just sat there, listening to this stranger defend her in a way that made her feel seen for the first time since she'd boarded this plane. Vanessa Chin had tears in her eyes too, still recording, knowing that this footage would be important, that it would matter, that stories like this needed to be told. Other passengers were nodding, murmuring agreement. A woman in seat 4C said, "This is wrong. This has been wrong from the beginning." A man near the back called out, "That little girl deserves an apology." Beverly looked around frantically. Her career was imploding in real time and she could feel it happening. She tried one more time to regain control. Everyone needs to calm down. You're all overreacting. I've been nothing but professional. Professional? Robert Dalton's voice cracked like a whip. You told a child that her dead parents should have given her an easier name. You mocked her for being in a spelling competition while deliberately mispronouncing her 5-letter name. You confiscated her journal when there was no safety reason to do so. Which part of that was professional? Beverly's face crumpled. She had no defense because there was no defense. She'd been caught, called out, exposed in front of a cabin full of witnesses who'd seen everything and had finally decided to speak up. Dylan Park, emboldened by the support of the passengers, stepped forward. Beverly, I think you should go to the back galley. I'll handle first class for the rest of the flight. You can't. Actually, I can. As a flight attendant, I have the authority to make decisions about passenger safety and comfort. And right now you're making passengers uncomfortable. Preston Whitmore pulled out his phone, and even though they were still in airplane mode, he made a show of opening his notes app. What's your employee ID number, Beverly? I want to make sure I spell your name correctly when I file my complaint with the airline. Beverly's face went white. She looked at Sharon one more time and maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret? Shame? It was hard to tell. But whatever it was, it came too late. She turned and walked stiffly toward the back of the plane, her shoulders rigid, her 15-year career hanging by a thread. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Not polite applause this time, but real, genuine, supportive applause for Sharon, for Dylan, for everyone who'd spoken up. Patricia Dalton reached forward and gently touched Sharon's shoulder. You were so brave, sweetheart. So brave. Sharon turned around in her seat, tears still on her cheeks, and whispered, Thank you for saying something. Nobody ever says something. Patricia's own eyes filled with tears. I know, baby. I know. But that changes now. If you're watching this and feeling that fire in your chest, that sense that this is the kind of story the world needs to hear, then smash that subscribe button right now. Because we're not done yet. What happens next proves that standing up for yourself doesn't just change your own life. It changes everyone watching. Subscribe because this story is about to reach its most powerful moment. Let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest in the comments. When was the last time you saw injustice happening and actually spoke up? Not thought about speaking up, not felt bad about it later, but actually used your voice in the moment? Tell me your story, because every time someone stands up, it makes it easier for the next person to do the same. Dylan Park walked to Sharon's seat, reached up, and pulled down her leather journal from the overhead bin. He handed it to her gently. You might want this back, he said with a kind smile. Sharon took it, clutching it to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because in that moment it was proof that her story mattered, that her voice mattered, that she mattered. And the flight to Washington, D.C. had suddenly become about so much more than just getting from one place to another. The applause had died down, and Sharon was still clutching her journal to her chest when Preston Whitmore stood up from his seat. He had that look on his face, the one that people who know him from the business world recognize immediately. It's the look he gets when he's about to make a move that changes everything. I have an idea, Preston announced to the cabin, his voice carrying that natural authority of someone used to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. He turned to Sharon. Sharon, would you mind demonstrating your abilities? Sharon looked up at him, confusion written all over her face. She pushed her glasses up nervously. How do you mean, sir? Preston's expression softened. A friendly spelling competition. You versus anyone who volunteers. Nothing scary, nothing intimidating. Just a chance to show everyone here what you're capable of. Sharon's eyes went wide. Here? On the plane? Why not? We've got time. We've got an audience. And I think people would love to see what a National Young Scholars Championship competitor can do. From the back galley, Beverly's voice cut through the cabin, dripping with sarcasm. This is a flight, not a classroom. We have regulations about. Preston turned to look at her, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. I'll donate $5,000 to the charity of the winner's choice. The cabin erupted. Passengers who'd been quietly watching suddenly sat up straighter. People leaned into the aisles to see better. $5,000 was serious money. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore. This was a challenge. Beverly, still standing in the back, felt every eye in first class turn toward her. She'd been humiliated, called out, exposed as unprofessional. Her pride was wounded and her career was on the line. And here was Preston Whitmore, this billionaire tech investor, essentially daring someone to compete against the child she'd been tormenting. The child she'd claimed couldn't even have an unusual name spelled correctly. She could walk away. She should walk away. Any reasonable person would recognize this as a trap and decline gracefully. But Beverly Hutchins was not thinking reasonably. She was thinking about 15 years of seniority, about her authority being questioned, about a cabin full of passengers who'd sided with an 8-year-old over her. Her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Fine," Beverly said, her voice sharp and defensive. "I'll do it. Easiest $5,000 I'll ever make." The cabin buzzed with excitement and disbelief. Passengers were whispering to each other, some shaking their heads, some leaning forward eagerly. Vanessa Chin repositioned her phone again, her hands trembling slightly because she knew she was about to capture something significant. Dylan Park looked horrified. He stepped toward Beverly and whispered urgently, "Don't do this. Please. Just let it go." Beverly ignored him and walked back into first class, her chin up, her shoulders back, projecting a confidence she probably didn't feel. Preston gestured for Beverly to stand in the aisle across from Sharon's seat. "All right then. I'll moderate. For transparency, I should mention I was a spelling bee champion myself, 1985 regional finals. I know how this works." He pulled out his phone, switched it off airplane mode briefly to access his dictionary app, then switched it back. "We'll do this properly. I'll give you each a word. You'll spell it. We alternate who goes first. Best of 7 rounds. Sound fair?" Sharon nodded, her face pale but determined. Beverly just crossed her arms. "Sharon, since you're the younger competitor, you'll go first each round. Ready?" Sharon's voice was small but steady. "Yes, sir." Preston looked at his phone, selecting the first word. "All right, Sharon. Your first word is accommodate. As in, the hotel can accommodate 50 guests." Sharon took a breath. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the airplane's engines humming. She spoke clearly, carefully. "Accommodate. ACCOMMOD, accommodate." "Correct," Preston said, and a ripple of encouraging murmurs went through the cabin. He turned to Beverly. "Same word. Accommodate." Beverly barely hesitated. "Accommodate. ACCOMMOD, accommodate." "Correct." The cabin settled in. This was happening. An actual spelling competition at 30,000 feet, between an 8-year-old prodigy and a flight attendant who'd spent the entire flight demeaning her. Preston continued. "Round 2. Sharon, your word is liaison. As in, she served as a liaison between the two departments." Sharon closed her eyes for just a second, visualizing the word the way her grandmother had taught her. "Liaison. LIASO, a liaison." "Correct." Beverly didn't even wait for Preston to finish giving her the word. "Liaison. LIASO, a liaison." "Correct." 2 rounds down, both competitors perfect. But Sharon's hands were shaking slightly, and Beverly's confidence was building. A few passengers exchanged worried glances. Maybe this wasn't going to go the way they hoped. "Round 3, Preston announced. "Sharon, your word is conscientious." As in, she was a conscientious student. This word was harder. Sharon bit her lip, thinking. The cabin held its breath. "Conscientious. CONSCIENTIOUS. Conscientious." "Correct." A small smattering of applause broke out. Patricia Dalton whispered, "Come on, baby. You've got this." Preston turned to Beverly. "Conscientious." Beverly hesitated this time. Her eyes narrowed as she worked through the word in her mind. "Conscientious. CONSCI." She paused. "ENTIOUS. Conscientious." "Correct," Preston said, though his tone suggested he'd noticed the hesitation. The cabin was fully invested now. Passengers in economy had started standing up, trying to see what was happening in first class. A flight attendant from the back was watching from the galley, her mouth hanging open. "Round 4, Preston said, and his tone shifted slightly. He was about to make this harder. "Sharon, your word is borough. As in, she lives in the borough of Manhattan." This was a tricky one. Borough has that unusual spelling that trips people up. Sharon knew it though. She'd studied this exact word for the regional competition that qualified her for nationals. Borough. Borough. Correct. Preston looked at Beverly. Borough. Beverly's confidence faltered visibly. She started strong. Borough. Borough. Then she stopped, doubt crossing her face. "No, wait. Borough. Preston shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The correct spelling is Borough. Your first attempt was right, but you changed it." Beverly's face flushed red. "I was distracted. Someone coughed. Can I try again?" "That's not how spelling bees work," Preston said firmly. "You get 1 attempt." Sharon is now in the lead. Beverly looked around the cabin wildly, and the passengers looking back at her had expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction. She'd walked right into this and everyone knew it. "Round 5, Preston continued. Sharon, your word is pneumonia. As in, the patient was diagnosed with pneumonia. Pneumonia. The silent P. Another classic trap word. But Sharon had been spelling difficult words since she was 6 years old. Pneumonia. 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 Correct. The cabin erupted in applause. Sharon was 4 for 5. She was winning. This 8-year-old child who'd been dismissed and demeaned was defeating the adult who'd claimed she didn't belong. Preston turned to Beverly. Pneumonia. Beverly stared at him and something in her broke. You could see it happen, watch the exact moment when her pride shattered and reality came crashing in. She shook her head. This is ridiculous. I'm not doing this anymore. This isn't what I signed up for. I'm a flight attendant, not a game show contestant. Preston's voice was ice. So you forfeit? I'm not forfeiting anything. I'm just not participating in this circus. That's called forfeiting. The cabin had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of people watching someone's dignity collapse in real time, watching karma deliver its verdict. And then Sharon spoke. Her voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger with every word. Miss Hutchins, would you like to spell my name now? Beverly turned to look at her, confusion and anger mixing on her face. What? My name. Would you like to spell it? Since you've had such trouble with it all flight. Beverly's jaw clenched. I know your name. Then spell it, please. The cabin was holding its collective breath. Vanessa Chin had tears streaming down her face as she recorded, knowing she was capturing something profound. Beverly, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, spelled it out. Sharon. There. Happy? Sharon nodded slowly. Correct. 5 letters. Just like I told you. Now, Miss Hutchins, can you spell prejudice for me? Beverly's face went completely white. The word hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what it was. Sharon didn't wait for an answer. Her voice was calm now, steady, like she'd found something inside herself that she didn't know was there. Prejudice. Prejudice. It means judging someone before you know them. Before you understand their story. She paused, and in that pause you could have heard a pin drop. Can you spell assumption, Miss Hutchins? Assumption. It means deciding something is true without proof. Like assuming I didn't belong in first class because of how I look. Like assuming my name was difficult because you didn't want to say it correctly. Like assuming I was here because of diversity programs instead of because I earned it. Preston Whitmore was smiling now, not a smug smile but a proud one. The smile of someone watching justice unfold in real time. Sharon continued, and her voice grew even stronger. Can you spell dignity, Miss Hutchins? Dignity. It means treating people with respect. Like how my grandmother treats everyone, even the people who look down on her for being a janitor. Like how my parents taught me to treat others before they died. Tears were rolling down her cheeks now, but she didn't stop. She stood up from her seat, and even though she was still just a tiny 8-year-old girl, she seemed to fill the entire cabin with her presence. Sharon reached up to the overhead bin, opened it herself, and pulled out her journal. She held it against her chest and looked directly at Beverly Hutchins. Miss Hutchins, my name isn't hard to say. It just comes out of someone who doesn't want to try. My parents gave me this name. My mother chose it because it means a plain, a flat, open space. She said she wanted me to be a place where people could rest, where things could grow, where there was room for everyone. They died when I was 5 years old. In a car accident. On a Tuesday. I remember because it was the day I was supposed to bring cookies to school, and my mom had stayed up late making them. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. My grandmother, Lucille Collins, works double shifts as a janitor at Cincinnati General Hospital. She mops floors. She cleans toilets. She takes out trash. And she does it with more dignity than most executives show in boardrooms. She saved for 6 months to help send me here. 6 months of extra shifts and skipped meals and working through arthritis pain. Sharon took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was clear as a bell. I'm 8 years old. I've been reading since I was 3. I qualified for the National Young Scholars Competition by scoring in the 99th percentile on standardized tests against students twice my age. I did it while grieving my parents. I did it while watching my grandmother work herself to exhaustion. I did it because I wanted to make them proud. I wanted to prove that kids like me, kids who lose their parents, kids who are raised by grandmothers who clean for a living, kids who don't have money or connections or privilege, we belong anywhere we choose to be. The cabin was absolutely silent. Some passengers were openly crying now. Patricia Dalton had her hand over her mouth. Robert Dalton had tears streaming down his face, This man who'd fought for civil rights in the 1960s, watching an 8-year-old carry on that fight with nothing but her voice and her truth. Sharon looked directly into Beverly's eyes. "I know how to spell respect, Ms. Hutchins. RESPECT. Do you?" Beverly stood there, tears forming in her eyes but refusing to fall, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She said nothing. What could she say? What words could possibly respond to that? Dylan Park had tears running down his face too. He'd never seen courage like this, not from adults, certainly not from a child. Vanessa Chen's hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped her phone. She'd been making documentaries for 5 years, had interviewed activists and artists and survivors of every kind of injustice, but she'd never witnessed anything quite like this. Preston Whitmore pulled out his checkbook, real paper, old school. He wrote out a check for $5,000. He walked over to Sharon and knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Sharon Collins, you didn't just win a spelling competition. You taught everyone on this plane something about dignity, about courage, about standing up for yourself with grace and intelligence instead of anger." He handed her the check. "This is made out to you. You decide what charity it goes to. And when you get to Washington, D.C., when you compete in that championship, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that you already proved you belong anywhere you want to be." Sharon took the check with shaking hands. "Thank you, sir." Preston stood and turned to the cabin. "I think Sharon deserves a round of applause, don't you?" The first-class cabin erupted. Not polite applause this time, but standing ovations. Passengers were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping away tears. The noise was so loud that passengers in economy started standing up, trying to see what was happening, and when flight attendants explained, the applause spread through the entire plane. Sharon stood there in her navy cardigan and khaki skirt, her oversized glasses and burgundy ribbons, this tiny 8-year-old girl who just stood up to her bully and won with nothing but truth and intelligence and the unshakable dignity her grandmother had taught her. Beverly Hutchins turned and walked back to the rear galley. No one stopped her. No one said anything to her. They just watched her go, and the silence that followed her was more devastating than any words could have been. If this story is giving you chills, if you're feeling that fire in your chest that makes you want to stand up and cheer, then you need to subscribe right now. Hit that button because stories like this, stories about regular people finding extraordinary courage, these are the stories that change the world one heart at a time. Subscribe because we're almost at the end and you need to see how this resolves. Let me ask you something and I want you to really think about it before you answer in the comments. If you were on that plane, would you have spoken up when Beverly first started mistreating Sharon? Would you have been Patricia and Robert Dalton, or would you have stayed silent and hoped someone else would handle it? Be honest, because understanding our own capacity for courage is the first step to actually being brave when it matters. The plane was descending now, beginning its approach to Washington, D.C. And Sharon Collins, the youngest qualifier in National Young Scholars Competition history, was about to land not just in a new city, but in a completely new understanding of her own power. The applause was still echoing through the cabin when the cockpit door opened, and Captain James Rodriguez stepped out. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that comes from 30 years of flying commercial aircraft. But right now, his face was tight with barely controlled anger. He'd heard everything. Every single word. The cockpit audio system picks up cabin conversations, and he'd been listening to the entire confrontation unfold while flying the plane. He'd heard Beverly's condescension, her microaggressions, her final humiliation. And he'd heard an 8-year-old child give one of the most powerful speeches about dignity he'd encountered in his entire career. Captain Rodriguez walked straight past Sharon's seat, nodding at her with respect, and continued to the back galley where Beverly was standing, her arms crossed defensively, her face blotchy from holding back tears. "Ms. Hutchins," his voice was quiet but firm, the voice of someone who commanded absolute authority, "we need to speak privately. Now." Beverly followed him into the rear galley, and the curtain closed behind them. Passengers couldn't hear what was being said, but they could imagine. Dylan Park, standing near the first-class galley, allowed himself a small, relieved breath. He'd been working under Beverly's thumb for months, enduring her criticism, her passive-aggressive comments, her threats about his probationary status. And now, finally, someone with real authority was holding her accountable. Dylan grabbed the beverage cart and wheeled it into first class with a genuine smile on his face, the first real smile he'd worn all flight. He stopped at Sharon's seat and knelt down beside her. "Sharon," he said gently, "would you like some hot chocolate? I make the best hot chocolate on this entire airline. Secret ingredient, extra marshmallows." Sharon looked at him with those big eyes behind her oversized glasses and nodded. "Yes, please." Thank you. While Dylan prepared the hot chocolate, Patricia Dalton unbuckled her seatbelt and moved from seat 3B to the empty seat next to Sharon in 2B. She settled in carefully, her elderly frame moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who's earned every one of her 68 years. May I sit here, sweetheart? Patricia asked, even though she was already sitting. Sharon nodded, still clutching her journal. Patricia reached over and gently took Sharon's hand. My granddaughter is your age. 8 years old. Her name is Emma. She's brave and smart and kind just like you. But I don't think she would have had the courage to do what you just did. And you know what? Watching you today reminded me that I need to be braver too. Sharon's eyes filled with tears again. Really? Really? I'm 68 years old, and I've spent a lot of my life staying quiet when I should have spoken up. I've witnessed injustice and told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that someone else would handle it, that it wasn't my business. But you showed me today that silence is a choice, and it's not always the right choice. Patricia squeezed Sharon's hand. You didn't just stand up for yourself today, honey. You reminded all of us what courage looks like, what dignity looks like. And I'm going to tell my granddaughter Emma about you. I'm going to tell her about the brave little girl I met on a plane who taught her grandmother to be better. Dylan returned with the hot chocolate, topped with a mountain of marshmallows and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Sharon took it gratefully, wrapping her small hands around the warm cup. Preston Whitmore, still standing in the aisle, pulled out his checkbook again. He'd already written one check, but he was writing another now. When he finished, he walked over to Sharon. Sharon, I already gave you one check for winning the competition. But I'm writing another one. This one is for $5,000, made out to the literacy program at your school in Cincinnati. Because you shouldn't have to choose where that first check goes. You earned it. This one is separate, a donation in your honor. Sharon's voice was small. My school doesn't have a literacy program, sir. Preston smiled. It does now. I'll make sure of it. And I'll make sure your grandmother never has to work a double shift again unless she wants to. Consider it a scholarship fund for your education all the way through college if you want it. Sharon's hand flew to her mouth. Sir, that's too much. No, Sharon. It's not nearly enough. But it's a start. Across the aisle, Vanessa Chen had finally stopped recording. She wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and leaned across to Sharon's row. Sharon, my name is Vanessa Chen. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been recording what happened today, and I would like your permission to use this footage for a documentary I'm making about everyday dignity, about ordinary people standing up to injustice in extraordinary ways. Sharon looked uncertain. I don't know. Vanessa continued quickly. I would never use it without your permission and your grandmother's permission. But I think your story could help other kids who are going through similar things. It could help them find their voice. It could help adults remember to do better. If you say no, I'll delete every second of footage right now. But if you say yes, I promise I'll tell your story with the respect and dignity it deserves. Sharon thought for a moment, then said quietly, if it helps other kids, then yes. But only if it helps. Vanessa smiled, fresh tears in her eyes. It will. I promise you it will. Behind Sharon, Robert Dalton had been quiet for a while, just watching everything unfold. But now he leaned forward and spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Sharon, I need to tell you something. I was a civil rights lawyer in the 1960s. I fought cases in courtrooms across the South when segregation was still legal, when people like me who stood up for equality received death threats, when justice felt impossible but we fought for it anyway. He paused, his voice getting thick with emotion. But somewhere along the way I got tired. I retired. I told myself I'd done my part, that it was someone else's turn to fight. I started ignoring the small injustices, the microaggressions, the everyday cruelties that people inflict on each other. I told myself it wasn't as bad as what we'd faced in the 60s, so it wasn't worth making a fuss. Robert shook his head. But you reminded me today why I started fighting in the first place. Not for the big landmark cases, but for moments like this. 4 8-year-old children who deserve to travel without being demeaned. For people who just want to exist with dignity. You reminded me that the fight isn't over just because I got tired. And I'm sorry I almost stayed silent today. I'm sorry I hesitated. But I promise you, I won't hesitate again. Sharon turned in her seat to look at him. Thank you, sir. Thank you for saying something. Dylan Park, who'd been listening while preparing drinks for other passengers, walked back over to Sharon. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. Sharon, I need to thank you too. Beverly has been bullying me for months. Ever since I started this job. She's criticized everything I do, threatened to get me fired, made me feel like I didn't belong here. And I let her do it because I was scared. I needed this job. I'm the first person in my family to have a career like this, and I didn't want to mess it up. He knelt down so he was eye level with Sharon. But watching you stand up to her, watching you refuse to accept her treatment even though you were scared, even though you're just 8 years old, it made me realize I've been accepting things I shouldn't have accepted. You gave me courage I didn't know I was missing. So thank you. Truly. Sharon reached out and squeezed his hand. You were kind to me when no one else was. You brought me cookies and said you were sorry. That mattered. From the back of the plane, Captain Rodriguez emerged from the rear galley. He walked back to first class and stopped at Sharon's seat. Young lady, on behalf of this airline, I want to apologize for how you were treated today. What happened here was unacceptable, and I want you to know that appropriate action is being taken. He glanced back toward the rear galley. Ms. Hutchins has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. She will not be working the remainder of this flight or any flights until this matter is resolved. Captain Rodriguez's voice softened. But more importantly, I want you to know that you handled yourself with remarkable grace and courage. I've been flying for 30 years and I've never seen anyone, adult or child, stand up for themselves with such dignity. Your parents would be incredibly proud of you. Your grandmother clearly is raising an exceptional young woman. Sharon's voice was barely a whisper. Thank you, Captain. The pilot nodded and returned to the cockpit. The plane was in its final descent now, the lights of Washington, D.C. visible through the windows. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and passengers began preparing for landing. Dylan made one final announcement over the PA system, his voice warm and genuine. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Washington, D.C. On behalf of the flight crew, I want to thank you for flying with us today. And I want to personally thank all of you for being the kind of people who speak up when they see injustice. The world needs more passengers like you. The cabin broke into one more round of applause, and Sharon felt herself blush again, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something else. Pride maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that her voice had power, that standing up for herself mattered, that she was worthy of respect and dignity no matter what anyone else thought. The plane touched down smoothly, and as it taxied to the gate, Sharon looked out the window at the city where she'd compete in the National Young Scholars Competition. She felt different than she had when she'd boarded in Atlanta. Stronger. Surer of herself. Ready. When the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood to gather their belongings. But several of them stopped by Sharon's seat first. They shook her hand, wished her luck in the competition, told her she was going to do amazing things. One woman handed her a business card and said, "When you're older and ready for college, you call me. Full scholarship to any university you want." Sharon collected these kindnesses like the achievement stickers on her purple suitcase, each one a reminder that goodness exists, that people care, that standing up for yourself attracts other people who want to lift you higher. Dylan helped Sharon with her suitcase, carrying it off the plane for her personally. As they walked up the jetway, Sharon turned back one last time to wave at Preston, Vanessa, Patricia, and Robert. They all waved back, these strangers who'd become something more in the span of a single flight. At the gate, a young woman in an airline uniform stood holding a sign. And on that sign, in perfect, careful handwriting, it said, "Sharon Collins, welcome to Washington, D.C." Sharon's name. Spelled correctly. Said correctly when the gate agent greeted her. "Hi Sharon. We've been expecting you. Your grandmother is waiting for you right over there." Sharon looked where the gate agent was pointing, and there, standing near the windows with tears streaming down her face, was Lucille Collins. She was still wearing her lavender dress, still wearing her Sunday shoes. She'd been at the airport since before the plane even took off because she couldn't stand the thought of Sharon landing alone in a strange city. Except Lucille hadn't flown to D.C. She'd been in Atlanta. There was no way she could be here unless. Sharon ran. Her suitcase forgotten, her journal clutched to her chest, she ran straight into her grandmother's arms and sobbed. Deep, relieved, exhausted sobs. Lucille held her tight, rocking her back and forth, whispering, "I know, baby. I know. I'm here. I'm here." When Sharon finally pulled back, she looked up at her grandmother in confusion. "How are you here?" Lucille smiled through her tears. "A very kind man named Preston Whitmore called the airline while you were still in the air. He bought me a last-minute ticket with his miles, had a car pick me up from the airport and bring me straight here. He said my grandbaby shouldn't land in D.C. alone after the flight she'd had." Sharon burst into fresh tears and Dylan, who'd been standing nearby with her suitcase, had to turn away to wipe his own eyes. Lucille finally noticed the check in Sharon's hand, the one Preston had written. "Baby, what's this?" Sharon handed it to her. It's for my school. For a literacy program. And Grandma, he said you don't have to work double shifts anymore. He set up a scholarship fund for me. For college. For everything. Lucille's legs nearly gave out. Dylan rushed to bring her a chair. She sat down heavily, staring at the check, at her granddaughter, at this impossible day that had started with a nervous goodbye at security and ended with blessings she couldn't have imagined. "Tell me what happened, baby," Lucille whispered. "Tell me everything." And Sharon did. Standing there in the airport, with her grandmother holding her hand and Dylan listening nearby, Sharon told the whole story. She told it honestly, without exaggeration, without making herself sound braver than she'd felt. She told about being scared, about being hurt, about finding her voice when she didn't think she had one. When Sharon finished, Lucille pulled her close again. "Your mama and daddy are looking down from heaven right now, and they are so proud. So very proud. Not because you won some spelling competition on an airplane, but because you stood up for yourself with grace and dignity. Because you didn't let someone else's cruelty make you cruel. Because you're exactly the person they hoped you'd be." Sharon pulled out her journal, the one Lucille had given her that morning. She opened to the page she'd been writing on before Beverly took it away, and she read aloud what she'd written earlier. "I need to prove I belong here. I need to show them that kids like me deserve to be in first class too." Then Sharon flipped to a new page and began writing something different, reading it aloud as she wrote. "I learned something today. Being underestimated doesn't define you. Other people's assumptions don't limit you. Fighting back with intelligence instead of anger is not weakness, it's strength. And honoring my parents doesn't mean being perfect. It means being exactly who I am, standing up for what's right, and remembering that dignity isn't something someone can take from you. It's something you give yourself." She looked up at her grandmother. "Grandma, I don't need to prove I belong anywhere. I belong because I exist. I belong because I'm me. And that's enough." Lucille Collins, this woman who'd worked double shifts and cleaned toilets and sacrificed everything for her grandbaby, looked at Sharon with more love than any heart should be able to hold and whispered, "That's exactly right, baby. That's exactly right." 3 days later, Sharon Collins competed in the National Young Scholars Competition. She placed second in the spelling and linguistics category, losing only in the final round on a word she'd never encountered before. But she wasn't disappointed. She'd proven what she needed to prove, and it had nothing to do with winning competitions. The footage Vanessa Chen recorded on that flight became part of a documentary called Everyday Dignity: Stories of Standing Up. It premiered at film festivals across the country and eventually aired on streaming platforms. Sharon's story became required viewing in schools, in corporate diversity training, in anywhere people needed to remember that dignity matters, that speaking up matters, that courage doesn't have an age requirement. Beverly Hutchins was not fired, but she was suspended without pay for 6 months and required to complete extensive sensitivity training before returning to work. She eventually requested a transfer to ground services, unable to face the passengers who might have heard about what happened on Flight 1847. Dylan Park received a commendation for his professionalism under difficult circumstances and was taken off probationary status early. He's still flying, and he tells Sharon's story to new flight attendants in training, reminding them that their job isn't just about safety and service, it's about human dignity. Preston Whitmore established the Sharon Collins Scholarship Fund, which has since provided full educational funding for over 200 students from underprivileged backgrounds. He also increased his sponsorship of the National Young Scholars Competition, with a specific focus on making sure talented kids from all backgrounds have access to opportunities. Robert and Patricia Dalton became volunteer advocates for children's rights organizations. Robert came out of retirement to take on pro bono cases involving discrimination against minors. He says Sharon reminded him why he became a lawyer in the first place. And Sharon? Sharon Collins is 12 years old now. She's in 7th grade, still wearing oversized glasses, still reading at a college level, still being raised by her grandmother who no longer has to work double shifts. She mentors younger students who face discrimination, teaching them what she learned on Flight 1847, that your voice matters, that standing up for yourself with dignity is the most powerful thing you can do, and that being underestimated is only a problem if you start believing it yourself. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about courage and dignity and standing up for what's right, then I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button, turn on notifications, because stories like Sharon's need to be told, need to be shared, need to be celebrated. We need more voices like hers in the world, and subscribing helps make sure these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. And finally, I want to ask you one last question. Share your own story in the comments. Tell me about a time when you stood up for yourself or for someone else with dignity. Tell me about a time when someone stood up for you. Tell me about a time when you wish you'd been braver. Your stories matter just as much as Sharon's, and someone reading the comments might need to hear that they're not alone, that courage is possible, that dignity is always worth fighting for. Sharon Collins boarded Flight 1847 as a scared 8-year-old trying to prove she belonged. She landed as someone who knew without question that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. And that's the most important destination any of us can reach. Remember her name. Sharon. Sharon. 5 letters. Simple. Beautiful. Unforgettable. Just like the girl who taught an entire airplane what courage really looks like.